Welcome to Dialogue. This conversation is part of a series on Trust the Experts, and today we are focusing on statisticians and public polls. There's something just fundamentally reassuring about a number, isn't there?
There really is.
Yeah.
They offer a kind of intellectual quietude
That's a great way to put it.
in a world that's just so full of noise and arguments and all these conflicting opinions. Numbers seem like the ultimate safe harbor. They're like this minimalist, clean design, no emotional baggage, no clutter.
Exactly. Numbers wear these lab coats made of decimals, and they never, ever raise their voices. They just present the data.
Right,
And
yeah.
because people will argue about anything and everything, numbers get to step in and just conclude. And once a number has concluded something, the discussion feels over. It feels settled. And for anyone listening, it feels safe. It's this illusion of objective, impartial authority in a really messy world.
And that safety is precisely the illusion we are diving into today. Our whole mission here is to unpack the story of statistics, not as these neutral truth seekers who just record reality, but as professional narrators who are actively, constructing it. We're looking at how these numbers learn to shape belief, how they drive public behavior, all without ever technically having to tell a lie.
That is the perfect framework. We really need to look behind that decimal point and understand the human choices being made
The people choosing the numbers,
Yeah.
framing them.
and reporting them. It's the subtle game of confidence where all this mathematical rigor gives cover to what are actually highly subjective decisions. We're really examining the architecture of certainty.
And that confidence is everything. We feel so much better when we can quantify our anxieties.
Right.
Or quantify an election result or a big social trend.
It turns chaos into something manageable.
It does. But we have to remember that statistics are, at their core, a human invention being applied to very human problems.
So let's start at the very beginning, because statistics did not come from some, pure academic quest for scientific truth. This wasn't Galileo trying to measure the cosmos.
Not even close. Statistics began as a quest for pure, unadulterated control. If you trace the history, the earliest uses were entirely pragmatic and governmental. In fact, the word statistics itself comes from the term status or statecraft.
Statecraft, so it was a tool for governance from the absolute beginning.
Precisely. States needed to count the things that allowed them to exert power and optimize their resources. They needed to count land
For taxes.
for taxes. They needed to count crops for supply chains, and crucially, people for conscription and for more revenue. It was really the original big data project, and it was focused not on individual insight, but on administrative efficiency on a massive scale.
It sounds like the first large-scale attempt to transform all this messy, unpredictable human activity into predictable, manageable little entries in a ledger.
That is the core insight. Take 18th century Europe. Governments there started developing these really complex population statistics, and the language they used was always very high-minded.
Of course.
They talk about promoting public welfare or improving the condition of the poor, but the immediate operational goal was strictly administrative.
Right.
It was about how to better calculate tax yields, how to efficiently conscript young men into armies, and how to regulate the populace with the absolute maximum efficiency.
It's the ultimate reductionist strategy, isn't it? When you can reduce a dynamic population of millions of individuals into quantifiable data points, birth rates, death rates, tax receipts, you just eliminate all the human chaos from the governing equation.
You do. You get to replace messy negotiation and political compromise with cold, hard calculation.
It creates a manageable abstraction.
It does. Once you transform a complex society into a set of fixed, measurable data points, you can govern by spreadsheet. And this power is enduring. It's a straight line from that 18th century census taker to the modern government analyst using algorithmic models to predict resource allocation or even, criminal hotspots.
The objective is always the same.
Always.
Yeah.
Efficiency through quantification.
And very early on, statisticians developed one of their most powerful and, you could argue, one of their most intellectually deceptive tools, the average.
Ah, the average. I call it our most misleading friend.
I like that.
Because averages sound so fair, don't they? They suggest this perfectly representative central truth that everyone just kind of hovers around.
Yeah.
But they can dramatically obscure reality, especially when the underlying distribution is wildly skewed by outliers or extremes.
And the classic example of this early deception perfectly illustrates how statistics can present a true number that tells a completely false story.
Absolutely. Think back to the 19th century discussions around average life expectancy. This number was cited all the time as being shockingly low. often around 40 or 45 years old.
And the interpretation was?
The widely accepted public interpretation was that most adults died prematurely. It implied this brutal, short existence for everyone, which fed right into all these narratives about the harshness of the era.
But here's where it gets really interesting for anyone listening. The number, let's say 40 years, was mathematically correct. It was a precise, true calculation.
It was.
But the interpretation, the idea that most adults died young, was radically skewed by one monumental factor.
Incredibly high infant and child mortality. That's the critical missing context.
So it wasn't adults dropping dead in their prime.
Not at all. The tragedy of children dying before their 5th birthday just pulled that mathematical average way, way down. If an individual survived childhood, which, was admittedly difficult, they regularly lived into their 60s, 70s, and beyond, just as people do today.
So the data point was mathematically true, but the conclusion derived from it, the whole narrative, was so misleading. It was almost the exact opposite of the lived experience for a surviving adult. The average lied without technically uttering a falsehood.
It's the perfect microcosm of statistical narrative control. Use a true number to support a predetermined conclusion. And this connects directly to you, the listener, today. Think about modern metrics presented as simple averages. Average household salary, average retirement savings.
Or average housing costs in a city. If you live somewhere like New York or San Francisco, the average home price is often pulled up so dramatically by a few multi-million-dollar sales that it makes the number completely useless for the typical person just trying to buy an apartment.
It hides the median, which is the actual halfway point. So if the average is telling you that you are behind, but you are actually ahead of the median, you might be reacting emotionally and financially to a total phantom statistic. We're constantly absorbing a narrative based on a central point that may not represent the typical lived experience at all.
You have to learn to ask who or what is skewing this average.
Exactly.
So that focus on administrative efficiency soon morphed into something much deeper, a really philosophical project. Statisticians became fascinated with defining normal.
Right.
They shifted their entire focus from measuring external objects like taxes or crops to measuring humanity itself. And this is where the sociological trouble really starts to brew.
The trouble begins with applying probability curves to human characteristics. The key figure here is a 19th century Belgian astronomer and statistician, Adolphe Quetelet. He introduced the concept of the l'homme moyen.
The average man.
The average man.
So he wasn't just measuring stars anymore. He was measuring height, weight, arm span, even what he thought were moral characteristics, trying to define this ideal central specimen of humanity. Sounds kind of harmless, but it carried enormous weight.
It was an intellectually ambitious project, but ultimately a deeply dangerous one. Quetelet took the mathematical concept of the bell curve, the idea that errors cluster symmetrically around a true mean, and he just applied it directly to human traits.
And that was sold.
The result was that the mathematically central point, the average, suddenly gained this moral and sociological authority it never, ever deserved.
Okay, let's unpack that critical shift. Once the average man was defined mathematically, normal, silently and almost instantly became the ideal.
That's it.
So if the average American man is, say, 5'9", then 5'9" becomes the measure against which all other heights are judged.
That's the subtle, insidious step. Deviation, the act of being far from the center of that bell curve, is mathematically necessary. You need it for the curve to exist. But in a sociological sense, that mathematical deviation was instantly perceived as a defect.
So the bell curve stopped being just a description of distribution.
And it became a prescriptive template for how society should look. We all just absorbed that message quietly, creating this deep societal pressure to conform to a quantified idea of normalcy.
And once you've defined that baseline of what's normal, it's only a short, really treacherous jump to actively refuting statistics to justify social hierarchy and discrimination.
Which brings us straight into the dark history of eugenics in the early 20th century.
Yeah.
Statistics provided the essential intellectual scaffolding for eugenics. Proponents used newly developed, standardized tests, most notably early versions of IQ tests and population data, all in an attempt to prove the biological inferiority of certain ethnic, racial, or national groups who statistically fell outside their definition of the ideal mean.
So they weren't relying on just overt prejudice anymore. They were quantifying it. They were producing graphs and tables and percentages. They wrapped their pre-existing prejudice in that authoritative lab coat of decimals.
And the numbers appeared scientific and therefore immutable.
And that appearance was catastrophic.
It was. Because the foundational flaw wasn't in the calculation of the score. The flaw was that the tests themselves were fundamentally rotten. They were heavily culturally biased, they were language dependent, and they were administered selectively to groups already marginalized by society, like new immigrants or specific racial groups.
So if an immigrant arrived in the U.S. speaking very little English and was immediately given a complex, culturally specific test, they would obviously score poorly. The statistician would then publish this as proof of their biological inferiority, when in reality, all they were measuring was a language barrier and cultural displacement.
Exactly. The conclusion that certain groups were biologically or intellectually inferior was a predetermined outcome masked by statistical authority. The statistical result gave the necessary cover for political action.
And we really have to emphasize the real-world cost of this. This scientific data directly contributed to policies like restrictive immigration quotas and, tragically, sterilization laws in various countries aimed at eliminating so-called undesirable traits.
It's a painful example.
It's a stark example of how the framing, the selection, and the application of measurement can mask a deeply biased agenda under this guise of objective truth.
And it serves as a necessary warning. Quantifying a concept doesn't make that concept inherently true or moral. If you measure societal prejudice with a gold standard ruler and report it with a 95% confidence interval, you still just have scientifically validated prejudice.
You, the listener, have to always scrutinize the foundations and the assumptions of the measurement itself before you ever accept the conclusion.
So we've moved from statistics defining the individual to statistics trying to define democracy. After this struggle to define normal, public polling took the stage, and it promised this exhilarating shortcut. We can quantify the collective will of the people.
Public polling offered that promise, but right from the start, it ran into the exact same fundamental problem as those IQ tests.
It's a sample.
The sample mattered infinitely more than any mathematical rigor you apply to it later.
You can have the most complex algorithms in the world, but if the ingredients you put into that statistical blender are biased, the output is going to be biased. It's that simple.
Look at the early political polls in the 1930s.
A perfect example. They suffered from severe sampling bias because, frankly, convenience was paramount. It was easy and cheap to survey people who subscribed to major magazines or who owned landline telephones,
which systematically excluded huge demographic swaths of population.
the poor, rural populations, minorities.
So the results accurately reflected the opinion of a wealthier, more established demographic, but they weren't remotely representative of the country's actual voting base.
And yet the headlines screamed certainty. This overconfidence culminated in polling's most famous, most glorious, spectacular failure, the Literary Digest disaster.
This failure is just a masterclass in the dangers of confusing quantity with quality.
It really is. In 1936, the Literary Digest magazine was the authority on political forecasting. They were the gold standard. And they predicted a massive landslide victory for the Republican, Alf Landon, over the incumbent Democrat, Franklin D. Roosevelt.
And they had the numbers to back it up. This wasn't some small, flimsy survey. They mailed out massive quantities of questionnaires, and they got millions of responses back.
It was an enormous, expensive undertaking.
Which is why their prediction felt so solid, so undeniable.
But the methodological selection was fatally flawed. Who do they mail those millions of postcards to?
People on lists of phone owners and car registrations.
Exactly. And in 1936, during the height of the Great Depression, owning a car and a phone was a luxury item. These were overwhelmingly wealthier, anti-New Deal Americans.
And the result was complete humiliation. Roosevelt won in an absolute landslide, carrying 46 out of 48 states. The poll was enormous in its sheer size, a statistical titan, but utterly useless in predicting reality.
All that volume of data couldn't compensate for the fundamental bias in who they chose to ask.
What's so fascinating here is that polling didn't retreat or apologize or just disappear after this public spectacle.
You'd think it would have.
But if anything, they learned the opposite lesson. They realized they just needed to refine the presentation to protect their authority.
So they just doubled down on the scientific look of it all, rather than abandoning the core idea of quantifying opinion.
Absolutely. This is the key insight into maintaining statistical authority. It doesn't require perfection.
It requires repetition and a refined presentation. Polling moved away from the massive, flawed samples of the digest and towards smaller, but theoretically better, samples constructed using demographic quotas. They employed better math to project those small samples onto the entire population, and most crucially, They projected more confidence than ever before.
It's the ultimate pivot. Instead of admitting that the underlying methodology of boiling complex human opinions down into a single percentage might be inherently flawed, they just made the execution look sleeker.
The math looked denser.
And the authority sounded louder. They just rebranded uncertainty as a precise metric.
And once polling refined its methods, it began to master this fine art of opinion engineering. That is, strategically crafting the questions and presenting the results in a way that maximizes the desired narrative or, minimizes any ambiguity.
We've all gotten used to seeing that little bit of small print that's supposed to counteract this certainty, the margin of error or the confidence interval. But polls have learned how to downplay this crucial caveat until it's virtually meaningless to the average person reading it.
It's the illusion of certainty delivered in a single number. Let's run a typical scenario. You see a poll. Candidate A leads candidate B 51% to 49%, and the reported margin of error is plus or minus 3%.
Okay, so mathematically that means candidate A could be as low as 48%.
51 minus 3.
And candidate B could be as high as 52%.
49 plus 3.
They are, by the pollster's own stated criteria, in a statistical tie. Candidate B might even be leading. The poll is completely inconclusive.
And yet, 9 times out of 10, what does the headline say? Candidate A pulls ahead. Or A takes a commanding lead.
Right.
Why? Because the media narrative prefers clarity, even if it's manufactured clarity, over the accurate, ambiguous truth that the race is a toss-up. Ambiguity doesn't generate clicks or satisfy the public's craving for a definite answer.
That's the power of framing the output. But the framing starts much, much earlier with the questions themselves. Pollsters are true experts at subtly guiding your answers before you even get to the checkbox.
This is opinion engineering in its purest form.
Give me an example.
Take contrasting questions. If you ask a respondent, do you support welfare? The response rate is often statistically lower
Okay.
than if you ask, do you support assistance for low-income families? The shift can be dramatic.
The word welfare carries decades of political baggage. It has all these negative associations, maybe of misuse or dependency.
Exactly. But assistance for low-income families sounds empathetic, it sounds socially responsible, and it's generally acceptable. The underlying beliefs of the person answering didn't change at all.
Just the framing, the moral context of the question did all the work.
And this manipulation goes beyond just language. It's what pollsters call order effects. The sequence of the questions can dramatically change the result because opinions aren't these stable, fixed things. They're often created in the very moment of the survey itself.
Order absolutely matters. What's the best example of how that sequencing can shift a person's perceived belief?
Consider a comprehensive poll about law and order. If the poll starts by asking participants several detailed, vivid questions about their fear of crime in their neighborhood, questions designed to heighten anxiety, maybe asking them to rate their safety at night,
Right, you're getting them worked up.
before asking them about their support for punitive policing measures, like aggressive stop-and-frisk policies or mandatory minimum sentences, what happens?
You've cognitively primed them. By forcing them to feel fear first, you've made that extreme punitive solution suddenly feel a lot more acceptable.
Exactly. The result is a dramatically higher level of reported support for those punitive measures. The statistic wasn't measuring a deeply held, pre-existing, stable belief. It just captured the mood and temporary anxiety the poll itself created in the respondent moments before.
It's a self-fulfilling measurement loop. It manufactures the very opinion it claims to be observing.
And this manipulation is what keeps the political horse race alive, especially with this obsession over the undecided voter.
Which raises an important question. Why do we and the media treat this group with such reverence?
They're often treated like this mythical, thoughtful swing voter who holds the key to the entire election.
The noble, final holdout whose decision will determine our collective fate.
But statistically,
Yeah.
they are frequently just noise.
Right.
They might be people who genuinely don't care, people who misunderstood the survey, or just people who refuse to commit to anything for anyone.
Yet the polls give them immense weight.
Why? Because narratives need suspense. They are crucial for that horse race obsession. You need a variable to track and to worry about and to discuss endlessly on cable news. Without the undecideds, the story is over too soon.
And this manufactured uncertainty feeds directly into the ultimate statistical strategy, the bandwagon effect. The polling feedback loop is arguably the most powerful mechanism in modern elections.
Because polling does not just measure opinion.
It actively shapes it. That's the critical distinction.
Studies consistently show that voters are far more likely to support the candidate who is perceived as the likely winner. When a major pollster declares a frontrunner, that report acts less like an objective observation and more like a catalyst.
It encourages hesitant voters to jump onto the winning side.
Polls create winners, which attracts votes, which then validates the original poll.
Statistics calls this measurement. Politics calls it strategy. It's like the stock market analyst who gives a bullish recommendation on a stock he just bought for himself.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this whole polling obsession has successfully transformed the complexity of elections into the simplicity of a spectator sport.
Who's up, who's down, who has momentum?
Policy just vanishes. It gets relegated to the small print on a campaign website. Only the drama, the daily movement remains.
We've swapped serious discussions about governance for glorified sports commentary. You turn on the news and the pundits are talking about a candidate's field position and momentum shifts instead of the substance of their tax plan or their foreign policy.
It's the pregame show that constantly ruins the actual policy game. It replaces long-term strategy with short-term, daily statistical anxiety.
If political polls engineer social opinion, then economic statistics engineer market confidence and government narratives. This is where the selection of what to measure becomes absolutely paramount.
It is. Governments and large organizations, just like pollsters, learn to select the indicators that tell a favorable story, often regardless of the actual reality on the ground being experienced by citizens.
Economic statistics are fascinating because they often function as just definitions of good news.
Take unemployment rates. When the government reports that the unemployment rate is dropping, it sounds like an unambiguous, across-the-board win for the economy.
But the calculation of that rate is inherently strategically selective. It's not simply count of everyone who doesn't have a job.
Precisely. The headline number, the one you always hear about, often referred to as U3, systematically excludes an entire category of people who are experiencing profound economic distress.
The discouraged workers.
The discouraged workers. These are individuals who have stopped actively looking for jobs because they've been searching for so long that they believe no suitable work is available for them anymore.
So if I lose my job and I keep applying, I'm unemployed and I count toward that negative number.
Right.
But if I give up and stop submitting applications, I effectively vanish from the unemployment statistic altogether. The official number U3 improves, even if my underlying reality of labor force participation or long-term financial security does not.
This allows the government to report a continuously favorable number, suggesting the economy is recovering or strong, even while large segments of the population are quietly exiting the labor market out of sheer desperation. It's good news by definition, achieved by systematically excluding the bad news from the equation.
Okay, let's pivot to inflation. This is one of the most frustrating statistics for the public because what you feel at the grocery store or at the gas pump, the actual cost of living, often seems totally disconnected from the official number, the Consumer Price Index, or CPI.
The CPI is meant to measure the cost of a basket of goods, but the calculation changes over time through something called substitution bias, or as you called it, the basket of convenience.
And it's a brilliant example of statistical narrative control.
It's designed to minimize reported inflation.
So explain that substitution bias in detail, because this is something that hits close to home for everyone listening.
Okay, so as prices for certain goods rise dramatically, let's use the example of steak. The CPI calculation assumes that you, as a rational consumer, will substitute that expensive item for a cheaper, similar one, like chicken or pork.
So it adjusts the calculation.
It adjusts the calculation to reflect the cost of the replacement item, the chicken, not the price increase of the original, more expensive one, the steak.
So if the price of steak doubles and I decide I can only afford chicken tonight, the CPI reflects a moderate inflation rate because the overall cost of my protein basket only went up slightly. The statistic minimizes the reported inflation.
That's the calculation. Meanwhile, in your real life, you are acutely aware that you are eating worse, your choices are restricted, and you are definitely noticing the soaring cost of the items you haven't substituted yet, like your rent or gas.
So economic officials can reassure the public that everything is fine.
While the public experiences a relentless erosion of their purchasing power. The number is mathematically true for the theoretical substitution basket, but practically false for your lived reality.
And the selective measurement applies to social metrics too, right? Like crime statistics. We're constantly shown graphs with crime rates rising or falling.
Crime statistics reflect reporting, not necessarily the actual occurrence of crime. This is a critical distinction that can fundamentally alter policy narratives.
So if, for instance, reporting increases for issues like domestic violence or sexual assault issues that were historically and notoriously underreported.
The official crime rates will appear to spike. This can happen even if the actual incidence of violence has remained flat or potentially even declined due to prevention efforts.
But the statistic is just measuring the willingness of victims to report and the effectiveness of law enforcement in recording those incidents.
But the narrative immediately shifts. Crime is spiking, we need more punitive measures, we need more police funding, and the policies follow the perception created by the changing numbers, which in this case might simply be measuring improved trust in the system.
Moving into public health, we see the profound power of statistics when they're used to enforce population behavior. During public health crises, graphs, projection curves, and predictive models become essentially gospel for policymakers and the public.
They transform into instruments of official authority, and they're often used explicitly to enforce compliance, stay home, wear a mask, change your behavior.
Right. We saw this where the worst-case scenarios and the worst-case projections completely dominated the coverage, and any uncertainty was minimized just to keep the message clear and strong.
And that certainty is deemed necessary for effective public messaging. However, the model problem is central to understanding the limitations of this kind of predictive statistics. Models predict futures that do not exist yet.
And they are entirely dependent on their initial assumptions.
Entirely. The variables the modeler chooses to input and the relationship the model assumes exists between those variables.
So if the model assumes a high rate of infectivity and a low compliance rate with masking, it's going to predict a high catastrophe level.
But if you change only the assumption about masking compliance, the entire model shifts dramatically. But for the public, that initial graph is treated as a fixed outcome, not a projection based on a whole bunch of fluid assumptions.
We saw this so vividly with epidemiological models during recent large disease outbreaks. Multiple high-profile models, using just slightly different starting assumptions about transmissibility or incubation periods, would diverge wildly in their predictions.
Model A would predict 5 times the fatalities of Model B.
Yet, both Model A and Model B were often presented to the public with equal confidence by their respective authorities. We were told repeatedly to trust the math.
Even when the math was producing contradictory outcomes from one model to the next, it was a call to trust the statistical methodology and the experts who developed it, regardless of the conflicting results.
It creates a fascinating philosophical problem for the listener, right? If 10 experts give you 10 wildly divergent predictions, why should you trust the average of their math any more than you trust your own observations?
The presentation of certainty completely masks the underlying necessary uncertainty that is built into any projection of the future.
We also have to consider the human element of the people being surveyed in polls, especially on moral or social issues. There's this systemic bias built into human interaction called social desirability bias.
And it heavily skews many social statistics.
It's a major factor in any self-reported data.
Humans want to present themselves in the best possible light. We want to pass the social test. So respondents are far more likely to over-report socially approved behaviors like voting or donating to charity, recycling, exercising regularly.
So if a pollster asks, did you vote in the last election? The percentage who say yes is almost invariably higher than the official count of ballots cast.
Every time. Polls end up reporting this slightly virtuous, idealized version of the population. They're measuring aspirational virtue rather than the quiet, sometimes messy reality of human behavior. The numbers are inflated by good intentions.
And finally, we have to address what happens when we just have so much data that we can find any relationship we want. Data dredging and the confusion of correlation versus causation.
What's so fascinating here is that with the rise of massive data sets and modern computing power, something will always appear statistically significant purely by chance, even if it's completely random and meaningless.
And statistical significance just means a relationship is unlikely to be random.
It does not mean the relationship is real or causal. The classic, often cited spurious correlation demonstrates this perfectly. Studies showing a strong mathematical correlation between the rising consumption of ice cream in the summer and the rising rate of violent crime.
They rise together. Mathematically, the correlation is strong enough to get published.
Yes, because both rise due to a third unmeasured variable, temperature.
Heat.
People are outside more, they're drinking more, they're buying more ice cream. But if you strip away that context, you can publish a headline that suggests ice cream consumption leads to violence. The statisticians might shrug and admit it's just correlation, not causation.
But the headlines will celebrate a new, shocking finding because it satisfies that human need for a simple, sensational story.
And that search for statistical significance often becomes a tool for what some call p-hacking. Researchers just hunting and hunting through data until they find some publishable correlation, a low p-value, even if the actual relationship is tenuous or meaningless, just to satisfy the incentive structure.
Which brings us back to the people behind the numbers. Let's pull the curtain back on the professionals, the academics, the analysts, the pollsters, and examine what they are fundamentally rewarded for.
Their incentive structure is absolutely critical to understanding why the narratives look the way they do.
So what are the rewards for a professional statistician?
They are rewarded for a very specific set of outcomes. Novel, unexpected findings, clear, definitive conclusions, and perhaps most powerfully media-friendly results that generate attention and funding for the next study.
They are rewarded for certainty, clarity, and novelty.
Exactly. They are fundamentally not rewarded for ambiguity, for stating that the data is inconclusive, or for publishing a study that just confirms what we already know without some dramatic new twist.
The structural bias ensures that the whole system selects for confidence and for drama.
A finding of the race is a toss-up, or the study was inconclusive, gets zero media traction compared to candidate A pulls ahead by 2 points, or we found a shocking new link between X and Y.
So studies and polls are inherently designed to look for the edges, the statistical significance, and the clear narrative, even when reality is just a messy, gray middle ground.
And when the predictions inevitably fail, when the candidate loses, when the public health model misses the mark by a massive margin, or when the economic recovery stalls, the authority of statistics often remains completely intact. Why is that?
Because the failure is almost always blamed on external factors, protecting the methodology itself.
Correct. The blame is externalized. The excuses are simple. The data was incomplete. The model was immediately refined after the fact, or the external situation just changed faster than the math could account for it.
The statistical framework itself is rarely questioned.
Only the specific inputs are blamed. The illusion of authority persists because the system is so adept at shifting responsibility.
So we arrive at the final illusion of neutrality. Statistics claim they are neutral. They claim to be merely the language of objective truth.
But that neutrality is always dependent on 4 key variables that are entirely human choices, and they happen long before any calculation is even run.
What are they?
The 4 variables that govern nearly every statistical outcome are: first, what is measured, and critically, what is deliberately excluded, like the discouraged worker.
Right.
Second, how it is framed, the wording of the question, the selection of the comparison group. Third, who funds it, and what is their inherent goal, be it political victory or public compliance. And finally, how it is reported, the headline, the visual presentation of the graph, the emphasis placed on or away from the margin of error.
Numbers don't lie, they narrate. And that narration is crafted by people with incentives, with assumptions, and with specific goals. It's an editorial process disguised as a simple, objective calculation.
The greatest power of statistics is not deception. It is the sheer force of confidence. Confidence transforms uncertainty into authority and probability into prediction. It reassures us that the world is a tidy, quantifiable place, even when it is not.
And to trust the experts without examining those methods, those assumptions, and that framing, that is not rationality. That is submission to a quiet, decimal-laden narrative.
We are constantly told to trust the experts, the statisticians, and the analysts. But if the number is chosen, framed, and interpreted by people with incentives and a narrative to sell, then the real question isn't what is the number, but whose story is that number telling?
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.